Falcha, welcome back. This is video number 3 of our book, Conversations with Nostradamus, part 2, video 3. And we left off on chapter 19 called Some Bad Wine. So Nostradamus knows that that Canon and her subjects are all still alive. They're incarnate. He knows he's not communing with spirits, incarnate spirits. And he says it doesn't matter. You guys need to understand that there's no such thing as death, he tells them. He describes, next he goes through some more stuff. And remember, this is frequently disjointed because frequently more than one thing at a time will be described through a set of quatrains, and they kind of peel them apart and talk about both of them, and they're at different times. Nostradamus describes the overthrow of the Shah of Iran by fundamentalism. He says fundamentalist religion is fascist and bad. Canon struggled to include this whole next part, and you have to keep in mind that this is in the mid to late 80s, and AIDS was just becoming, general public was finally becoming aware of it. AIDS, he said, now he says this, and she had real issues with what he said. I don't know. So he said that AIDS began with a virus from wild monkeys in Africa. A woman was bitten, and the microbe mutated. Her husband got it, and he was fooling around, and he spread it to a whole lot of people. They both died. And somebody gave blood, and their blood was carrying the virus, and that was the start of it. But that wasn't the end of it, because somehow an experimental group of scientists got a hold of it and experimented with it for drug testing, the efficacy of drugs. And they actually gave AIDS, the virus, the HIV, to pockets of people, one of which, this should come as no shock to anybody who remembers that time, a large community of gay men, and it was spread. The government was running the experiment for a specific reason. This is, according to Nostradamus, this was a government program that was studying a whole lot of sociological things, and one of the things it was studying was religious intolerance. And they wanted to infect groups of minorities that are not tolerated by the larger religious belief system to see how the people would react to it. Nostradamus said this. The government originally created the really deadly mutation. The woman that was bitten, it mutated and infected them and died, but the government even tweaked that. Nostradamus says that this is all going to come out in history. People will discover the truth about this. And he said essentially what the government did was create a plague. It was genocide. And those are the words that Nostradamus used. It wasn't supposed to spread. See, they didn't think it through. It was only supposed to affect isolated pockets of people. They didn't count on it getting into the blood supply, that kind of thing. They were inoculated with this chemical to see if it would help to get rid of it, but it was all intentional to make them susceptible too. This will be common knowledge. There's a book written in 1988 by Alan Cantwell Jr., a doctor, called AIDS and the Doctors of Death. And Nostradamus actually told Dolores that was an accurate book. Money for grants were given to the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. This was a genetically engineered virus intentionally unleashed. They spliced two naturally occurring things together. And part of the experiment that they did had to do with hepatitis B vaccine trials in New York City in the 70s amongst gay men. So there was a couple of different things all happening at the same time with basically the common outcome. The commercial vaccine was safe, but the experimental vaccine that they were fooling around with was really not intended for the public. Dr. Cantwell said it's impossible for a virus to just target gay men. That how would a virus know that it might know you're not a woman if you have a Y chromosome, but it's not going to know what your sexual behavior is. And unless there's some genetic marker for it, but we don't know that yet. And so this doctor, writing in 1988, said that the virus would not be able to know. And let's see if everybody can just think a minute and think internationally. Where else did they release this, and see what it would do to the population? Haiti and Africa. Other places in Africa. He predicts protests in the streets of New York City because of the economy. I'm thinking it's the Occupy Wall Street. It sounded like the way he described it. A global drought will start in Campania and Apulia in Italy, and it won't be noticed right away. It'll become a really devastating global drought. So I went to Dr. Google, and guess what? There is a burgeoning a burgeoning drought happening in Campania and Apulia. Those are two places, two regions of Italy that have devastated the crops in those two areas, and we'll have to watch and see what happens. He predicted nuclear pollution in the rivers of Europe. He said a French president with a lazy or weak eye will have a difficult time and will damage the economy in the 90s in France, because France is going through a spiritual challenge, and this president is part of the agent of that whole lesson. And I looked that up, and in the 90s, between 95 and 2007, the president of France was Jacques Chirac, and he had something going on with his eyes. Germany, at the time of Nostradamus, was many independent states. He said that it will one day become a very powerful nation. It'll threaten a bomb. It will try to annihilate the French, and the French will surrender to save their cities. And that's exactly what happened during World War II. In World War II, the British Empire will fall. And he said, and he said that it really doesn't exist as an empire in his time, but in 290 years it will, and he was right. Ogmios, after the Antichrist, will live out his days in peace and serenity. Nostradamus says China will fall to communalism. He predicted violence in China in 1989, and I looked it up, and there was. A band of Christian resistors will stand up against the Antichrist in China, and the Antichrist will take all of Greece and Cyprus and Carcassonne, which is a central controlling area of southern France. It's a really important route, central route. The Antichrist will battle Iraq and Iran. Nostradamus was really not feeling well, and he wanted to quit doing the session that they were doing. And when they asked him what was wrong, he said he thinks he drank some spoiled wine. Ugh. Chapter 20. We come at night. So John was again working with her, and Nostradamus too, and they're working in a group to try to figure out these horoscope charts. Nostradamus mentioned that there were a number of ancient astrologers and astronomers, and he knew them all by name, and their understanding of the stars in both astrology and astronomy came from the Sumerians and the Babylonians. They understood lunar and solar cycles. They understood the weather and volcanoes being affected by them, and that people would suffer the resulting fallout from that, and there would be famine and movements of populations, which, seems self-evident now, but at the time people were not completely aware of that. Nostradamus says lots of knowledge was lost in the past, but the Arabs were able to hang on to some of it, and he actually traveled to Malta and studied with some Arabs for a while. He describes what is obviously the Dreyfus Affair, who was a Jewish army officer in France who was accused of things that was an anti-Semitic thing. He said that this particular case would weaken the French state. He says there's a man in Germany during the rise of the Nazis who will develop a new philosophy which is really metaphysical and become a big metaphysical movement which will eventually turn into the New Age movement and eventually the Age of Aquarius. And he names him. His name was Rudolf Steiner. And Nostradamus says he was a lord of light to keep the lords of darkness, the Nazis, in check. He espoused anthroposophy. I can't say it. Anthroposophy. Yeah, anthroposophy. That man has the faculty for inner spiritual perception independent of the senses. Excuse me. He said that France would surrender to the Germans, and he actually literally said that the Nazis were pigs. I think he's doing a grave injustice to pigs, which are actually really nice animals. The earth shift will inundate most of England. People will flee to the Pennines and the Irish Central Mountains and to the Alps. There will be enormous starvation and disease. He says that people in his time don't realize about other countries. They're not even cognizant of really what's out there in the world. Most people didn't move more than 15 miles beyond their home. The Pope would be, who would be a good guy, would be assassinated. And the last Pope would be totally into finances and corruption and the Antichrist. And I know that some of this is repeating, but this is what they're presenting in the book as they're going through these quatrains, and I just wrote everything down. Chapter 21, the heart attack. So they began coming into Nostradamus' life at various ages, so they would contact him, but sometimes he'd be 50, and then the next time he'd be 30, and the next time he'd be 60, and there was no predicting when in his lifeline they would enter the scene. And they decided to write these in the order that they were received and not chronologically. So they come to Nostradamus, and he's working on the Kabbalah, the Jewish tree of life, I think. I'm terrible. It's the esoteric teachings of Jewish religion. He predicted the union of the Italian city-states in the 1870s. And he was really mad at them that they didn't understand about that. And so I did a little test. I said to my husband, how much do you know about Italian history? And he goes, well, not very much. And I said, so tell me what you know. And he said, well, they were all these little isolated, kingdom sort of things, and they finally united. And I said, you mean like city-states? He goes, yeah. I said, so you knew that? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, how do other people not know that? To me, there are some things that are just, you should know that. And he reminded me, and I think it's interesting to get his perspective because he went to all big California public schools. He said they stopped teaching stuff like that. I don't know what they were teaching, but they stopped teaching world history. Remarkable to me. But they were little city-states that were independent of each other, and, Lombardy and Tuscany and the city of Florence and the city of Venice. And eventually they did merge. It was Garibaldi, I think, yeah. I always want to say Giardelli because that's chocolate. Anyway, I'm in quite a mood today. The German, he predicted the German anti-nuke protests that were connected with environmentalists and anti-war, and he, as he put it, green. And he didn't really, be able to make a connection there. They're environmentalists, the green movement. He says in 1727, the Turks will attack Persia, and they did. He said it would be very much along religious lines, Arabs versus Christians. He took his mirror, that obsidian mirror, to Catherine de' Medici, who demanded that he come, and he showed her the French line of succession. She demanded it. He had a servant girl who spilled beans to somebody that he was up to all kinds of witchcraft, and de' Medici got the message and ordered him to come, and then she used him. He said it was walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. He says this is terrible, but it shows you what life was like then. He said the next time he gets a servant girl, he's going to find one who's already had her tongue cut out, who will be mute. Oh. So de' Medici had court magicians growing up, and so she was very familiar with magic, and she was a very conniving person. He said that there will be technical experts who are willing to go from Scotland to the Middle East for the Antichrist for money, and that he will have control of technological information. The Earth shift will end the war at Marseille, and the city and the Antichrist will fall. And it will be the end of a cycle and the end of the world as we know it. That this is inevitable. This is not something that we can prevent, the Earth shift. It's a universal Earth cycle. What we can affect is our behavior to each other here now. In the near future, there'll be a disgrace in the royal house of Windsor. But then he predicts a bomb on the prime minister's plane. I don't think that happened. I don't think there was any. The only thing I can think of that related to the royal family and bombs was when the IRA bombed Mountbatten, blew him up in his boat. He said that England will be reduced to a tiny island, and that eventually, in a very, very long time in the future, it'll start encroaching on French land because it wants to spread out and be in charge again. New York City will be destroyed by a new weapon, not a nuke, that kills people but does no infrastructure damage. It will poison the city and destroy life. It's some kind of chemical warfare. It would be a bomb placed in the harbor there, and as he describes it, there will be blood on the Statue of Liberty, which will be blown up. He said the last pope will die in Rome, and then there will be a new way of looking at religion and spirituality. He said that Corsica and Sardinia would be Antichrist bases used to attack southern France and Europe. The Turks will fight the Greeks, and Israel and Greece will ally. He suddenly left his session. He could be abrupt sometimes and just go, I'm out of here. So John says when the whole thing fell apart, the session ended, he said that Nostradamus was in medical distress. John said he rang a bell and the family ran in, that Nostradamus had some sort of medical thing, like he had a heart attack, and his family was able to help him through it. The guardians told John, leave, end the session, leave. So they gave Nostradamus some heart tonic, some kind of medicine, and John was making the observation, he really was really old this time when we saw him. The guardian warns that don't be presumptuous about coming. Nostradamus has no control in the timing. They just show up and they hope he's going to want to talk to them, and he does want to talk to them, but it's not always a convenient time. So by forcing our way in to their people's lives, that we, meaning she and her crew, they do a negative good. There's such a thing as a negative good. The intentions are good, but the end is still not good. Nostradamus experiences sessions as going on much longer than they experience it, 3 or 4 times longer. So they don't think they've been there very long, and it's been really a drag on him. He enjoys it, but the length of time is different, and he tires easily, and when they go and he's old, it's just too much for him. Chapter 22, The Hidden Room. They hoped that the next contact would reach Nostradamus at a healthier age, and the guides interfered to make that happen. John sees Nostradamus putting herbs away in his little room, which John is not allowed to go into, but he's also not allowed to tell Nostradamus about the heart attack. He was warned, don't talk about that. Nostradamus predicts that the English royal family will be led by an older woman, that it will lose its prestige and power, but that when Charles takes over, these will increase again. The Antichrist will march through southern France. Paris will be deserted because he has threatened bombs. He's bombed Athens and Rome, and then he threatens Paris, and everybody leaves. The Antichrist sets up headquarters outside Avignon. Then this utter turmoil around the year 2036, and there will be fighting between two royal brothers. Doesn't say who. I wonder. William and Harry. The Antichrist will try to bomb Geneva and Zurich, but the bomb will go off course and land in France and will cause biochemical contamination, the one that kills people, not the landscape. Nostradamus says that Venice is a great maritime state in his time, and in our time it will be sinking into the marshes. That most of Venice will eventually be underwater, and after the shift it will all be underwater. He predicts that in our time, a prince of the royal house in an Arab state will want power but won't get it. And I do think that there was jockeying for power in Saudi Arabia, I think. Nostradamus offers to show John the room upstairs that he has. It's a small secret room, and it's a little room he uses for rituals. It's the size of one of our bathrooms. It has a magic circle on the floor. There are books and scrolls and incense. Nostradamus meditates there. There are velvet wall hangings with occult symbols that John doesn't understand. Nostradamus keeps the room locked because his servants would denounce him as a witch. It's a religious retreat in a sense. And Nostradamus asks John to pray with him to reassure Nostradamus that John is not an evil spirit. The guardians later tell them that Nostradamus has to be careful because some evil spirits have come through the mirror. And when you pray, he wanted people to know you talk to God, and when you meditate, you listen to God. I thought that was interesting. Chapter 23, Nostradamus' first contact. In the next session, John sees Nostradamus standing with a wand, more like a small tree limb that's been filed to a point, and his name is in it in Hebrew. And he's doing some kind of ceremony calling spirits. He's invoking spirits. And John shows up. So it worked, right? Nostradamus is very young and seems new to the whole idea of summoning spirits and is kind of shocked that it worked. And he asks, they make the comment that he asks the question that everybody always asks the first time they look into the future. If you're from another country, they'll ask, who's the king? And if you're American, you'll ask, who's the president? Anyway, Nostradamus asks, who's the new king? And he predicts during the Troubles, a political party will arise. It's not political, but it's a party like a political party that's humanitarian and compassionate. They're going to migrate to Spain, which is now islands, and they'll form a spiritual party to be of service for the world. Nostradamus, although young, and he's written no quatrains this time that John is interacting with him, but he says that they seem familiar to him, and there's a speculation, a couple of paragraphs of speculation in the book about the nature of time and the overlapping of time and everything being simultaneous, and it's hard. So he predicts the Kaiser in World War I, the rise of militarism in Germany, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and he says the killer is originally from Venice. In our time, the president's son will die of AIDS before he is 20. I don't know what that is. He sees him with the Kaposki's sarcoma. He'll be the youngest son of a hated president. He predicts the union of provinces that exist during his time that are just loosely confederated into a united country of Switzerland. There'll be a dispute. This is great. There'll be a dispute in line of succession of Prince Charles' children. That guy in Australia, mayhaps. He predicts the fall of the Tsar and the aristocracy in Russia to communists. He says France will put the U.S. bases that are on their soil and their nuclear stuff out. They'll be done with it. He sees another civil war in the U.S. Oh, God, this gave me the chills when I read this. Not too far in the future of Dolores canon in the 80s, he sees another civil war in the U.S. with fundamentalist Christians fighting everybody else. It will actually be almost a religious war, and it will include much religious persecution. They will see themselves as the soldiers of Christ. Nostradamus says they are really soldiers of their own lust to rape, rule, and rob. Chapter 24, Nostradamus' philosophy. They have a new session where he looks like he's about in his 50s. He predicts Napoleon, the first Antichrist. He takes advantage of, Napoleon takes advantage of trouble that France is having with the monarchy and changing to a republic, and takes advantage of that change. After the troubles, a great leader will emerge. And this is in the world, an advanced being, and he went out of his way to say no, not Jesus. But this will be the great genius, and he'll be feared for his greatness. I think the proper word is intimidation. I think that he will be so, Nostradamus says this, that he will be so great, such a good person, and so intelligent, and so powerfully intelligent for the greater good, that it will freak people out. He talks about the Kennedys. This is so interesting to me, having done Roman history. He says that the Kennedy brothers, John and Robert, were the reincarnation of the Gracchi. This is the family Gracchus in the 2nd century BC. They were people, leaders of the people. They were reformers, political reformers. They tried to push for compassionate social change in Rome, and they ended up both dead. Isn't that interesting? And they said that there's a karmic relationship between Russia and the United States. We're working out something on a spiritual level with them. Russia is trying to strip wealth from the United States by messing with the weather. He said that they hope to lower food production in the U.S. to affect the economy. That El Nino was manufactured by this Russian weather program called the Eye of the Sea that's off Peru. It's a storm center. It's been there since 1945. And they've been manipulating weather with it, but the U.S. knows about it and will prevent it being effective. There are satellites and space technology also sent up to affect weather. He says everything has a karmic balance. Even countries have a karmic balance. The U.S. and Russia are in this sort of balancing act, and France and England are in this balancing act. He predicts in the late 1800s, Paris will become the art and the cultural center of the world, and it did. He says in our time, France is strengthening itself, that it actually has submarine forces that we're not aware of, and that they will eventually pull out of NATO. He predicts a guy called Voltaire, and he will discredit astrology. He'll start a new philosophy, and they will persecute astrologers, and that's what happened. After the Earth shift, France will be gone, and there will be no longer a national identity of all sorts. People will be united, but this thing will be so devastating that it will unite the people of the world. He said for a very long time, many bodies will wash upon the land. He predicts de Gaulle, fighting the Nazis and becoming president. He said a ship full of chemicals will explode in a harbor of Macau, and the city will burn, and many lives will be lost in the 1990s. And I couldn't find anything that seemed. I think the timelines are off. I think some things have been prevented or slightly changed, ameliorated. Some things do seem to have happened. In the 20th century, women will rise to power, and they'll bring about the destruction of religious and financial institutions, which is why they'll push back so hard, which is what they're doing. It will be the unleashing of feminine energies on the universe. The Persians will attack the Indian naval base by night, and this is related to the war with the Antichrist. Money from a noble house in Denmark will finance an archaeological dig at the Great Pyramids, which will reveal secrets never before known to humanity. And the archaeologists who get this Danish money will be French, and they're going to take all the credit. France is going to take all the credit, so that was a little dig. Chapter 25, The New Baby. This is the last session with John, who was moving away. Nostradamus, his wife, they just happened to come upon the day that his wife had a baby that morning. She had a son. And Nostradamus was doing the baby's horoscope. He said there'll be an attempt to overthrow the Libyan government, that the United States will be doing secret ops, that Libya is actually trying to expand into neighboring countries, and someone will try to overthrow it. And I can't remember what happened in Libya, except it was a huge, gigantic mess, so that may or may not be true. He describes the Middle East as a thunderstorm brewing, a time bomb waiting to explode. And, as I said, I can't keep track. And that's so interesting to me, because when I think of the Middle East, that's what I think of. I think of just this roiling. He says 2 men control the world in the 1980s. One is in New York City and one is in London. They're very powerful. They're hidden, but they control the world economy. And I did refer to the page, and I may or may not read it here. Let me see. I think I need to go to the eye doctor, I think. Yeah, he describes the guys, they wear glasses. He's 55. It's all pretty generic stuff. Tons of gold. He says it might be dangerous to know about these men, but people should know because they are dangerous. He said, you don't know their names, and the media doesn't know them. They're clandestine. They have great influence, especially on presidents and leaders of the different world governments. They are trying to manipulate the government of the Soviet Union to bring another leader into the net. I wonder if they helped put Putin in place. They control the media. They can do anything they want. Their power is enormous. And he showed them a globe with everything tied together in a net. These men are the movers and shakers of the world. They are incarnations of people who had power in other lifetimes, and now they're making their final bid for real world dominion, and they're the power behind the throne. They have a plan to control the world, and it's all falling into place, but the controller of the world will be the Antichrist. He says 2 men will bring the Antichrist figure into their power network, but he will topple them. Their plan will backfire on them. An important Swiss diplomat will be held captive by the Antichrist and killed. He will hold him hostage for a while for all the money in the Swiss banks, and Europe will actually do a limited nuclear attack on wherever he is. So he'll disappear for a while, and everybody will think, oh good, that's over, but he'll reappear from the Middle East, and he'll be more powerful than he ever was. And the timeline that they come up with is the mid-90s. I don't know. The Antichrist will enter Europe from Corsica and Tuscany, which is southern Italy. England and King Charles will hold him off at Gibraltar. France will ally with the Antichrist to save itself. Capitulate. The Antichrist will use nuns and other religious figures as spies. He will infiltrate areas with people dressed like religious people. England will have superior weapons. The Antichrist will attack Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and he says Yugoslavia, but it's split up now. So Nostradamus' wife had this baby this morning. She shows up in the room and she's dressed and everything, but John's observation is she looks just really pretty rough. She looks exhausted. Nostradamus says, makes a point of saying to John, I am of service to you. Please contact me again. And this is John's last visit. Chapter 26, a karmic debt repaid. John volunteered to do this tough astrology because he felt led to it. The reason for them coming together eventually actually became clear. She had done past life regressions for other people, but not John. And so he asked if she would do one on him, and so she did. And this is the story that comes out. This is who he was. He was a guy called Franz Weber in the 1880s in Germany. His father took the whole family to Switzerland to avoid World War I. And his father went into Swiss banking. John went into... Franz went into the University of Basel. He visited a woman astrologer and he began drawing horoscopes, but he didn't intensely study them the way John later did. But he liked to do runes. He dabbled in the occult. When John studied horoscopes in this lifetime, it was really easy for him, like he already kind of knew it, is what he said. Franz was drawn to the German Romantics and the work of Rudolf Steiner. Remember Steiner, the philosopher? And at first he was attracted to the Nazis because they glorified the German culture lifestyle. And he fell for the propaganda. He returned from Switzerland to Germany to help with the government. He became a Nazi and he worked in propaganda at the Berlin Bureau of Information. They used him because they liked his knowledge of astrology. Hitler used astrologers. Hitler used a lot of esoteric stuff. He was throwing them in concentration camps, or he was using them secretly in the government. Hitler wanted to use Nostradamus' quatrains to show how Germany would conquer the world. Franz was responsible for spreading this, but the Nazis twisted it. The Nazis were into occult sciences. They would go on the radio and read their version of Nostradamus. And they'd say, well, he predicted, that we were going to win. And Franz felt that the cause was worth being involved in this. And he published a book about Nostradamus, but they got him to change the quatrains to make the Germans look good. They basically were creating a national religion for the Nazis, creating a belief system for the master race. He was a member of the Thule Society, as was Hitler, and he had great wealth. He was an abusive, arrogant, and stern person, and his life this time was the debt he had to pay for that. He had to learn to be humble. And I don't think she says it in the introduction. There's a dedication to John. John died of AIDS at a very young age. Shortly after he left her working with her, he moved. So this all changed when Franz's wife brought home a lampshade that one of the other officers' wives had gotten from Dachau, made out of human skin. And Franz realized there was something really macabre going on, and he became suddenly extremely disillusioned, and he saw that these were sick people. And he became involved in the plot to overthrow Hitler when they tried to bomb him that one time, and he and his wife were shot as traitors. Actually, there were two attempts to bomb him. One was in, I believe, Munich when he was giving a speech, and he left early. And another time was in his wolf's lair, I forget what it's called. He was doing a big meeting, and a lot of the nobility and higher ups in the military, they planted a bomb, and somebody at the last minute, it was in a briefcase, and somebody moved the briefcase just to get it out from underfoot, and they happened to place it up against a stone pedestal of a table, which deflected the blast from Hitler. He was very badly injured, worse than they ever publicly admitted, but it didn't kill him. Anyway, his wife brought this home and he was disgusted, and then they were both shot as traitors for helping to try to kill Hitler. John, interesting. Now this goes back to some of the things we've done about past lives and their imprinting on future lives. John has a small hole in his sternum, a little bullet hole in his sternum, and no marks on the skin. The doctor discovered it on x-ray, and the doctor said he cannot explain it, that all he can say is it's some kind of birth defect. John says a lot of people in his life then, when he was a Nazi, are in his life now. He was shocked when a good friend in Dallas, by coincidence, had himself regressed, and he found out that he'd read the propaganda that John had written for the radio programs, and their present lives are very similar. The friend speaks fluent German. It was extremely easy for him. They have these parallel lives going on. If this life, John wasn't familiar with Nostradamus. He feels that this work is a karmic debt in a special way. In the past he used Nostradamus' teachings for bad, and in this life he's using it for good to make up for the lies that he spread in the past. Cannon found a book. Only one copy exists in the United States at the Library of Congress, and they loaned it out to her. It's Nostradamus and the Nazis by Elik Howe, who said Hitler's astrologer, Karl Kraft, and several others in his propaganda ministry worked with John and used astrology and the occult to manipulate the minds of the people. But simultaneously, they were arresting astrologers and confiscating their books. They wanted to control the information, is what they wanted to do. They didn't want anyone to be translating Nostradamus in a different way. Kraft also was educated at the University of Basel, interestingly enough. Goebbels was interested and saw that they could be used for propaganda and psychological warfare. And he was the one who pressured them to alter Nostradamus in favor of the Nazis. Kraft and John Franz disagreed with Goebbels and said that the Nazis would reproach us from the grave. Nostradamus would reproach us from the grave if we twisted his words. So they agreed only to do common sense stuff and not twist really important things. And then somebody else rewrote it. So their resistance was useless. The Nazis began what's called black psychological warfare for French radio and for leaflets that they dropped, threatening quatrains of Nostradamus from planes over France. But the British did the same thing in reverse in retaliation. Kraft refused to cooperate with that, and he was put into a concentration camp with other astrologers. The Thule Society used astrologers, psychics, spiritualists, pendulum readers, and mathematicians. They used anything they could to twist Teutonic German mythology and esoteric belief systems, kind of stick them all together into this belief system that they had. So this work in this lifetime of John's pays his debt, he says, to history and to Nostradamus. It's the wheel of destiny. Chapter 27, the world of the future. John asked Cannon to put him in a trance and let him go to the future. They'd never thought to try this before. And he ended up in 2087. He was in the body of a woman, so this is a future life of his. Her name is Zaria. He's looking out a window of a spaceship and looking she's inside of a spaceship that's actually a craft from another planet. They're going to a Federation mission in Sirius. So John's comment, this woman says, as John, that it's kind of like a commuter bus. They're the first humans that are going to this other galaxy, and it's going for an intergalactic talk and trading session. She had been born a healer was trained very young, was a doctor, but also used crystals, mental power, and visualization in ways that we're not familiar with yet. Married to a man named Huron, who's also on the ship. He's an architect, and he knew how to build buildings on other planets with different kinds of gravity. It was his specialty. ETs contacted the Earth for this mission, and that there are actually 2 ETs on the ship with them right now. They're bald, humanoid, with protruding eyes. Their ears are small and close to the head, flatter noses, medium height, golden brown skin. Their heads are shaped differently, but they project an aura of a loving nature. They have very thin fingers with cone-shaped tips, no hair, no fingernails. They communicate telepathically, and there's just this, it's a love fest on board. Everybody loves everybody else, and they sit and do circle meditations and stuff, so it's really a unique situation. The Earth has one government at this time called One World Government, and the headquarters, this is hilarious, the headquarters are in Omaha. Mutual Omaha. They don't call them cities, they call them planetary centers. There are other people that he sees as this Zaria woman, a black man who is going as an expert on flora and fauna, an Asian Indian man who's a philosopher, he's going to study philosophy, and an Asian woman who's going to be doing art and culture. They are needing to create new colonies in space. There's very little land left on Earth. It's mostly water. So they're colonizing the moon, they're colonizing Mars, and they're going to be colonizing these space stations that they're making with the help of ETs, and they will live very long. During the shift, ET got in contact to help people who were surviving, and they've been working with humans for 80 years. So what's left of the Seattle-Tacoma area is called Seal Center. No, it's called Northwest Island, but on it is Seal Center, and it's a space station. It's dedicated to exploring space study. It created a space port called Surveillance. It's a landing area for space vehicles. Planetary consciousness is taking place. The U.S. is part of this one world government. There's no polar ice. Because of pollution and destruction of the planet, we are 90% ocean, only 10% land. ETs have helped clean what's left of the remaining land. Because there were nuclear accidents, a huge patch of land in Asia, which is called the Asian island, is unusable. It cannot be used. It's 300 square miles of radioactivity. It is inhabited by those who like the old systems of governments and don't want to change, but they have lots of birth defects with very strange mutations. The Earth shift broke a reactor and it poisoned the whole area. Zaria says there was no nuclear war, lots of threats about it, but there were accidents. The old world was full of brutality, injustice, and hate. We want to avoid it all, so we just don't talk about it much anymore. They stopped the calendar and started a new calendar, started dating the one world government from 2039, 10 years after the shift. So they predict the shift will be in 2029. But so much of the times that they've worked out have not been accurate, or have been something similar but much less horrible has happened. I don't know what to think. Some few buildings were left, including a recreation of an American village of the 1980s. It's kind of like going to the Henry Ford Museum and Deerfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. It's a recreation of old America. They also have colonial villages, and they're just museums, basically, like Colonial Williamsburg. Now people are spiritual beings. They're enlightened. This is the pinnacle of a new time. They regard the life of the 1980s as something primitive and barbaric that they want nothing to do with. Most people are now able to remember previous lives, but there are only 120 million people left. He calls the Earth shift the transition, many people died during it and after it from diseases. If it had not been for ETs, all of Earth would have died out. ETs saved humanity. But now we need more area. Now, part of the Galactic Federation, the Earth is part of the Galactic Federation, which includes 15 different planets of ETs. To join a country or I don't know what to call it, I guess just a planetary population, must know the plan of the Creator, follow the plan, and be of one galaxy consciousness. And only advanced beings are allowed to incarnate at all into this. There are other solar systems. The closest is 300 light years away. And that one happens to be more negative, but they're kept away. They use an energy force to keep it away, like good juju, kind of. The others were involved in history, in our human history, and were identified, as demons. Those were ETs, but they are a force in the universe, and they do exist, and they are negative. The negative ones have control of yet to evolve worlds, still evolving worlds. ETs helped build vehicles that were needed for space travel. They travel on electromagnetic force fields. They use pure energy, photovoltaic energy from the sun, and other kinds of energies, but she says, I'm not a physicist. John had to stop because he started feeling sick, and he was told that the spaceship was leaving the dimension in its travel and that he had to leave. He said the woman was psychic and telepathic and was okay with him being a past life of her own. She was good with it. So what John did talk about did agree with what Nostradamus had predicted previously. The human spirit triumphed, the world did not perish, progress was not completely lost, and it was all with the help of ETs. We only have one possible future, but it's the different paths to it and what we experience that we affect. John moved to Florida, and Branda was much less available. And that's the end of Section 2 and the beginning of Section 3. And I'm going to stop, and I will do one more shorter video to end this. So this is the end of number 3 and start of number 4. And I hope you're enjoying this. These are some really interesting predictions. Okay. Slong of oil. I'll be back.